Welcome to Nocturnal Knowledge. Tonight, we're exploring Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Settle in as we journey through the complete text. If you enjoy this exploration, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the world's most influential books. Our journey begins now.
Introducing System 1 and System 2. To begin our journey into thinking fast and slow, we must first understand the foundational architecture of our thinking, a framework laid out with remarkable clarity by Daniel Kahneman. He presents our minds as operating through two distinct yet interacting systems. Let's start with an observation. Look at a portrait of an angry woman. Your experience is immediate. You instantly recognize her dark hair, and you just know she's angry. You might even sense she's about to say something unkind. This entire assessment arrived automatically, effortlessly. You didn't decide to analyze her mood, it just happened to you. This is the realm of System 1. It operates automatically and quickly, with little to no effort and with no sense of voluntary control. Now consider a different kind of problem. Multiply 17 by 24. You instantly know it's a multiplication problem. You might even have a vague sense that the answer is not 5,000 or 12. But to find the actual answer, you must engage in deliberate, effortful work. You have to retrieve the multiplication program you learned in school and execute it step by step. You feel the mental strain of holding numbers in your memory. This is a prototype of System 2 thinking. Your body even participates. Your muscles tense, your pupils dilate. This is mental work. Kahneman invites us to think of these as two characters in our mind. System 1 is the hero of the story. It's the impulsive, intuitive character that effortlessly generates the impressions, feelings, and gut reactions that guide our daily lives. It recognizes threats, understands simple sentences, and drives a car on an empty road. It's our fast, automatic pilot. System 2 is the supporting character. It's our conscious, reasoning self. It's the one that steps in when things get difficult, when a puzzle needs to be solved, or when an impulse from System 1 needs to be overruled. It's our slow, deliberate, and often lazy thinker. When we think of ourselves, we tend to identify with the thoughtful System 2. But the truth is, the vast majority of our life is run by the automatic System 1. System 1 is constantly feeding suggestions to System 2, intuitions, impressions, and intentions. Most of the time, System 2 just accepts these suggestions and goes along for the ride. It only mobilizes when System 1 runs into trouble, like when it's faced with a question it can't answer, such as 17 times 24. This interaction is incredibly efficient. It allows us to navigate a complex world with minimal effort. However, this efficiency comes at a cost. System 1 has biases. It loves to jump to conclusions and create simple, coherent stories, even if they aren't entirely true. It prefers what is easy and familiar over what is difficult and true. The lazy System 2, meanwhile, often fails to double-check the work of System 1, leading to predictable errors in judgment. Understanding the interplay between these two characters, the impulsive hero and the lazy sidekick, is the key to unlocking the rest of this book. By recognizing their distinct personalities, their strengths, and their critical flaws, we can begin to understand why we think the way we do, why we make the choices we make, and how we can start to make better ones. This dynamic between effortless intuition and effortful reason will be a recurring theme as we continue our journey through thinking fast and slow.
Having explored the fundamental nature of System 1 and System 2, we now delve into the intricate workings of the associative machine, the very engine of System 1. Imagine for a moment being presented with two words, bananas and vomit. Something quite remarkable just happened in your mind, even in the span of a second or two. You likely conjured unpleasant images, perhaps even experienced a subtle physical reaction, a slight grimace, a tightening in your stomach, maybe even a minuscule distancing of your physical self from the book. Your heart rate might have subtly increased, your palms could have felt a touch clammy. Your System 1, operating automatically and without conscious effort, reacted to the word vomit as if it were witnessing a real event. It even created a plausible, though entirely fictional, causal link. The bananas somehow led to the vomiting. This, in turn, might have triggered a temporary aversion to bananas. Beyond this immediate emotional and physiological response, your associative network has also been primed. You're now more ready to recognize and respond to words like sick, stink, or nausea. And of course, concepts associated with bananas, yellow, fruit, even perhaps apple or berries, are now more accessible in your memory. This is associative activation at play. Ideas trigger other ideas, setting off a cascade of interconnected thoughts, feelings, and even physical reactions. The word vomit didn't just activate the concept of sickness, it activated related contexts like hangovers or indigestion, making you more attuned to those as well. What's truly astonishing is that this complex chain of events, the mental imagery, the emotional response, the physiological changes, the activation of related concepts, all occurred automatically, effortlessly, and without your conscious control. Your System 1, faced with a simple juxtaposition of words, did its best to make sense of it by creating a coherent interpretation, even if that interpretation was purely imaginative. It created a narrative, evaluated a potential threat, and prepared you for future, albeit imagined, events. This intricate process, where ideas trigger and reinforce each other, is the essence of associative activation. This leads us to the concept of priming effects. These are the subtle, often unconscious influences of words and concepts on our subsequent thoughts and behaviors. You experienced a form of this earlier when we discussed how the mere mention of old age could influence walking speed. Psychologist John Bark famously demonstrated this with his Florida effect experiment. College students, after assembling sentences containing words associated with the elderly, like Florida, forgetful, bald, gray, wrinkle, walked significantly slower down a hallway afterward. They were primed to think about old age, and this priming influenced their behavior. Crucially, none of the students were aware of the theme of the words they had encountered, nor did they believe their behavior had been influenced. This phenomenon, where thoughts prime actions, is known as the ideomotor effect. Interestingly, this priming can work in reverse too. In a mirrored experiment, students asked to walk slowly, then recognized words related to old age more quickly. This demonstrates reciprocal priming, actions influencing thoughts and vice versa, creating a loop of associative coherence. This associative machine, powered by priming, is at the heart of how System 1 operates. It's the reason why seeing a happy face can make you feel happier, or why holding a pencil in your mouth in a certain way, forcing a smile, can actually make you perceive cartoons as funnier. It's also the reason why reminding people of money can lead to more independent and self-reliant behavior. but also to more selfish choices. The presence of subtle contextual cues, often entirely unnoticed, can shape our actions in profound ways. This is the essence of ubiquitous priming. The crucial point here is that System 1 is not merely a passive repository of information, it's an active, associative machine that continuously constructs meaning from the world. This construction process, however, is often automatic and unconscious, leading to the realization that there is indeed the stranger within, an unconscious influence shaping much of what we do. This stranger, your System 1, is the secret author of many of your judgments and choices, often operating without your conscious awareness. As we navigate this exploration, it's vital to remember that while System 1's operations are automatic and effortless, System 2, our conscious and deliberate self, can sometimes intervene. It can override these automatic impulses, though it often does so reluctantly, being inherently lazy. We'll see how this interplay, this constant negotiation between fast, associative thinking and slow, deliberate reasoning, shapes our entire cognitive landscape. Next, we'll explore how this associative machine, through the marvels and potential pitfalls of priming, contributes to a sense of cognitive ease, influencing our beliefs and even our perception of truth itself.
Having explored the associative machine in priming, we now turn to a concept that profoundly shapes our judgments: cognitive ease. Think of it as a dial on the cockpit of your mind, indicating whether things are going smoothly or if you're encountering friction. When the dial is in the easy zone, it signals that no threats are present, no major news requires attention redirection, and System 2, our more deliberate and effortful thinking system, doesn't need to be fully mobilized. Everything feels familiar, fluent, and good. This state of cognitive ease, as Daniel Kahneman explains, is powerfully linked to our mood and, crucially, to our inclination to believe what we encounter. When we feel cognitively at ease, we're often in a good mood. We tend to like what we see, trust our intuitions, and feel a sense of comfortable familiarity with the situation. This ease of processing makes us less vigilant, more superficial in our thinking, and as a consequence, more gullible. Conversely, cognitive strain, when that dial is in the strange zone, signals a problem. This strain can be triggered by reading instructions in a poor font, by encountering complicated language, or by simply being in a bad mood. When we feel strained, we become more vigilant, more suspicious, and we're more likely to engage System 2 for deeper, more effortful processing. While this can lead to fewer errors, it also tends to reduce our creativity and our reliance on intuition. This interplay between cognitive ease and our assessment of truth is a fascinating area. Consider the impact of repetition. Kahneman notes that a reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. This is the essence of the mere exposure effect. The more we encounter something, the more we tend to like it, and crucially for our understanding of truth, the more likely we are to believe it. Even repeating a phrase like, "the body temperature of a chicken," can make a subsequent arbitrary number attached to it feel more familiar, and therefore more believable. This ease of processing also explains illusions of familiarity, where a sense of having encountered something before leads us to believe it's true even if we have no concrete memory of having seen it before. Kahneman recounts how Larry Jacobi demonstrated this with made-up names like David Stenbill. Encountering these names later, even without conscious recall of having seen them before, they feel familiar due to the ease of processing, leading to the illusion of becoming famous overnight. This familiarity, this cognitive ease, is a powerful cue that System 1 readily interprets as truth. The implications for persuasive communication are profound. If you want your message to be believed, strive for cognitive ease. Maximize legibility, use clear fonts, and if possible, make your ideas rhyme or present them in simple, memorable ways. Even using easy-to-pronounce names for companies can make their stock appear more attractive. Kahneman's research suggests that the mere exposure effect, the mere ease of processing, can create a positive affect, and that this positive affect is often mistaken for accuracy. The remote association test, or RAT, provides another window into this phenomenon. Developed by psychologist Sarnoff Mednick, it measures creativity by asking participants to find a word that links three seemingly unrelated words. For example, cottage, Swiss, and cake all connect to cheese. What's remarkable is that even when people don't consciously find the solution, they often have a sense of cognitive ease, a feeling that the words are linked. This feeling, generated by System 1, can precede conscious reasoning. Crucially, research by German psychologists showed that positive moods amplified this intuition of coherence, more than doubling accuracy on the RAT. Conversely, negative moods rendered people incapable of intuitive judgments, essentially shutting down their access to System 1. So the ease with which we process information, the fluency with which ideas come to mind, and even our current mood can all powerfully influence whether we believe something is true. It's a reminder that our judgments aren't always the product of pure logic, but are often swayed by the subtle, automatic workings of our System 1, influencing everything from our daily beliefs to our perception of what is real. This deep dive into cognitive ease and its connection to our mood and belief systems sets the stage for understanding how our minds, often without our conscious awareness, construct our reality. It primes us for the next concepts: norms, surprises, and causes, and how our associative machine jumps to conclusions, often with a confidence that belies the fragility of its foundations.
Having explored the foundational concepts of how our minds operate, particularly the interplay between our intuitive System 1 and our more deliberate System 2, we now turn to specific ways these systems, especially System 1, can lead us astray. We'll delve into the law of small numbers, which highlights our tendency to overemphasize the representativeness of small samples, and then pivot to the pervasive influence of anchoring, where initial values, even arbitrary ones, unduly shape our judgments. One of the most striking examples of our mental shortcuts, or heuristics, comes from the study of statistical reasoning. When faced with data, especially when it pertains to something like public health, our minds often leap to conclusions without fully appreciating the underlying statistical realities. Consider the incidence of kidney cancer across the United States. Studies reveal that counties with the lowest rates of this cancer are often rural, sparsely populated, and located in traditionally Republican states. Naturally, our first instinct, driven by System 1's constant search for causality, is to attribute this to a healthy lifestyle, clean air, fresh food, a lack of pollution. It makes perfect sense. But then the pattern reveals its paradoxical twin. The counties with the highest rates of kidney cancer are also often rural, sparsely populated, and located in the same traditionally Republican states. This presents a conundrum. How can the same rural lifestyle explain both very high and very low cancer rates? The key, as statisticians Howard Weiner and Harris Zwerling pointed out, lies not in the lifestyle, but in the small numbers. The explanation is rooted in the nature of random sampling. Imagine a giant urn filled with marbles, half red, representing kidney cancer, and half white. We draw marbles to populate our counties. Random chance dictates that in small samples, like those from sparsely populated counties, we are far more likely to get extreme results, either a disproportionately high number of red marbles or a disproportionately low number of red marbles. In large samples, the proportion of red marbles will tend to hover much closer to the true 50%. Therefore, extreme outcomes, both high and low, are more likely to be observed in small samples. The counties with low cancer rates were likely just lucky draws, and the counties with high rates were unlucky ones. There's no causal explanation to be found for the lifestyle. The pattern is an artifact of sampling variability. This phenomenon, where we place too much faith in the representativeness of small samples, is what Tversky and Kahneman famously termed the law of small numbers. Even as we consciously know that larger samples are more reliable, our intuitive System 1 often fails to grasp the magnitude of this principle. We have a deep-seated expectation that even small samples will accurately mirror the larger population from which they are drawn. This leads to overconfidence, to inferring causality where only chance is at play, and to embracing patterns in randomness that simply aren't there. Now let's turn to anchoring. This bias occurs when an initial number, however irrelevant, influences our subsequent judgments. Amos Tversky and I demonstrated this with a rigged wheel of fortune. When participants were asked to note the number the wheel landed on, either 10 or 65, and then estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN, their estimates were dramatically different. Those who saw the number 10 estimated on average 25% of African nations in the UN. Those who saw 65 estimated on average 45% of African nations in the UN. The wheel itself was utterly meaningless information, yet it acted as an anchor, pulling their estimates towards it. This anchoring effect can happen in two main ways, illustrating the interaction of our two systems. Firstly, there's anchoring as adjustment, a deliberate, albeit often insufficient process of System 2. When we are given a starting point, say a high asking price for a house, we might try to adjust downward. However, we typically adjust just enough to feel certain we've moved away from the initial number, stopping short of a fully rational adjustment. This is why you might drive too fast coming off a highway, failing to adjust sufficiently from the higher speed anchor. Secondly, there's anchoring as priming, an automatic System 1 process. Here, the anchor's effect is subtler, influencing our associative memory. For example, being asked if Gandhi lived to be more than 144 years old might prime thoughts of extreme old age, influencing our estimate of his actual age at death, even if we know 144 is preposterous. The number activates associated concepts, biasing our retrieval of information. The German psychologists Thomas Musweiler and Fritz Strack provided compelling evidence for this by showing how numbers related to temperature primed thoughts of summer or winter words, influencing subsequent judgments. The power of anchoring extends into the real world, significantly impacting decisions in areas like real estate and negotiations. Real estate agents, for instance, are susceptible to the asking price, even when they insist they are immune to it. Similarly, in negotiations, the first offer often acts as an anchor, shaping the entire subsequent discussion. To resist this, it's crucial to recognize the anchor, acknowledge its potential influence, and actively seek information that contradicts it, perhaps by focusing on the minimal acceptable offer or the consequences of not reaching an agreement. Understanding these biases, the law of small numbers and anchoring, is not just an academic exercise. It's about recognizing the subtle yet powerful ways our intuitive System 1 can shape our judgments, often in ways that are not aligned with objective reality or rational calculation. As we move forward, we'll explore other heuristics and biases that illustrate how our minds systematically deviate from purely logical reasoning, often leading to overconfidence and flawed predictions.
Availability and representativeness.
We've journeyed through the initial encounters with System 1 and System 2, exploring how our minds effortlessly generate impressions and intuitions, and how System 2, though often lazy, can step in to manage more complex computations. We've seen how priming can subtly influence our thoughts and behaviors, how cognitive ease can lead us to believe falsehoods, and how a mental shotgun can fire off more computations than we intend. We've also touched upon the power of substitution, where an easier question is answered instead of a harder one, and the pervasive, often unacknowledged influence of our emotions on our judgments. Now, we shift our focus to two interconnected heuristics that profoundly shape our judgments of probability and frequency: the availability heuristic and the representativeness heuristic. These are not conscious strategies we employ, rather they are automatic operations of System 1, shortcuts that, while often efficient, can lead us astray. Let's begin with the availability heuristic. Imagine you're asked to judge the frequency of a particular event or the size of a category. How do you typically go about it? As Kahneman and Tversky observed, instances of the class will be retrieved from memory, and if retrieval is easy and fluent, the class will be judged to be large. This ease of retrieval, or availability, becomes our primary, often subconscious cue for estimating frequency. Think about the letter K. Is it more likely to appear as the first letter of a word or as the third letter of a word? As any Scrabble player knows, it's far easier to come up with words that begin with K than to find words where K is the third letter. We expect you to exaggerate the frequency of letters appearing in the first position because they are more available in your memory. This heuristic, however, can lead to biases. For example, news media tend to focus on dramatic and unusual events. A plane crash, though statistically rare, receives extensive coverage. This makes instances of plane crashes highly available in our minds, leading us to overestimate their frequency compared to more common but less dramatic events like car accidents. As Kahneman notes, availability, emotion, and risk are tightly intertwined. Vivid and emotionally charged events are more readily recalled, skewing our perception of risk. This ease of retrieval can also lead to what's called an illusory correlation, where we associate events that don't actually co-occur frequently or even at all. If we hear a few anecdotes about a politician's extramarital affairs, we might readily conclude that infidelity is rampant among politicians, even if objective data suggests otherwise. This conclusion is not based on statistical reality, but on the ease with which instances come to mind.
Having explored the pervasive influence of availability and representativeness on our judgments, we now turn to a crucial interplay between our intuitive System 1 and the more deliberate System 2. This is where we encounter the subtle but powerful ways in which causality can override statistical reality, and how our minds often misinterpret the natural phenomenon of regression to the mean. System 1, our fast-thinking associative machine, has an insatiable appetite for causal explanations. When presented with information, it doesn't just store facts, it weaves them into coherent narratives. This drive for causality is so strong that it can lead us astray, making us prefer a plausible story over statistical truth. Consider the classic cab problem. A witness identifies a cab involved in a hit-and-run as blue. We know that 85% of cabs are green and 15% are blue. We also know that witness is 80% accurate. If we were purely statistical beings, we'd calculate the probability that the cab was blue. But System 1 kicks in, and our preference for causality leads us to a different place. Now imagine a slight tweak to the problem.
Instead of being told that 85% of cabs are green, we're told that green cabs are involved in 85% of accidents. Suddenly, the statistical base rate transforms into a causal base rate. We immediately construct a stereotype. Green cabs are driven by reckless maniacs. This causal explanation primes us to believe that the accident was likely caused by a green cab, even though the statistical odds remain the same. Our System 1 seeking a narrative latches onto the idea of reckless green cab drivers, making it difficult for System 2 to adhere to the base rates. This preference for causality is a prime example of how a plausible story can trump raw statistics. This brings us to the concept of statistical versus causal base rates. We are far more likely to underweight statistical base rates, mere facts about populations, when they lack a causal connection to the individual case. Causal base rates, on the other hand, readily influence our judgments because they fit seamlessly into the story System 1 constructs. Think of stereotypes. Whether true or false, they provide a causal explanation for how a group behaves, and System 1 readily applies these to individuals. While social norms rightly caution against harmful stereotyping, it's important to recognize that ignoring valid causal associations can lead to suboptimal judgments. This leads us to another pervasive intuitive error: regression to the mean. This statistical phenomenon describes the tendency for extreme outcomes to be followed by more average ones. Imagine a group of flight instructors who noticed that when they praised a cadet for an exceptionally good maneuver, the next attempt was usually worse. Conversely, when they reprimanded a cadet for a poor performance, the next attempt was often better. Their intuitive conclusion: praise is detrimental and punishment is effective. But what they were observing was not the effect of their feedback, but the natural ebb and flow of performance. Extreme performances, whether exceptionally good or bad, are often influenced by luck. A cadet who performs brilliantly is likely to have had a lucky day, and that luck is unlikely to repeat. Conversely, a cadet who performs poorly is likely to have had an unlucky day, and their luck is likely to improve. The instructors, however, saw a causal link where there was none. They were punishing poor performance and being rewarded by a natural improvement, while praising good performance and being punished by a natural deterioration. This is the essence of misinterpreting regression to the mean, confusing correlation with causation. This misinterpretation is rampant. Think of the Sports Illustrated jinx, the idea that athletes featured on the cover of Sports Illustrated tend to perform poorly afterward. The actual explanation is simple regression to the mean. Athletes who make the cover have likely had an outstanding season, boosted by good luck. Their subsequent performance, while still good, is unlikely to be as exceptional, leading to a perceived jinx. The same illusion affects our daily lives. We praise children for a brilliant test score, and then wonder why their next score is merely average. We criticize a spouse for a bad mood, only to find them cheerful the next day. In each case, our intuitive System 1 seeks a causal explanation for the change, often attributing it to the praise or criticism, when the true cause is simply regression to the mean. Understanding this can help us tame our intuitive predictions. When evaluating performance, whether it's a student's grades, a company's stock, or even our own mood, we must be aware of the statistical reality of regression. Instead of seeking causes for every fluctuation, we should acknowledge the role of chance and the natural tendency for extremes to moderate over time. This means tempering our confidence in predictions based on single outstanding performances and recognizing that average outcomes are often a more reliable guide than exceptional ones. It also means being cautious about attributing success solely to skill and failure solely to flaws. As we move forward, recognizing when our intuitive judgments are likely to be swayed by these powerful forces, causality and regression, will be crucial for making more accurate and effective decisions.
We've journeyed through the landscape of our two thinking systems, System 1 and System 2, and explored how System 1, our intuitive, automatic, and often unacknowledged engine, operates through associative mechanisms, heuristics, and a drive for cognitive ease. We've seen how its judgments can be skewed by biases like anchoring, availability, and representativeness, and how it often substitutes an easier question for a harder one. We've also touched upon the surprising ways our emotions and even the way information is framed can dramatically alter our decisions. Now we turn our attention to a critical area where these intuitive predictions often falter: taming intuitive predictions and the power of the outside view. We all make predictions constantly. Economists forecast inflation, financial analysts predict earnings, venture capitalists assess profitability, and even in our personal lives, we predict our spouse's reaction to a proposal or how well we'll adjust to a new job. Some of these predictions are based on precise calculations, others on experience. But many of our intuitive judgments, especially those born from System 1, are often surprisingly unreliable, even when delivered with unwavering confidence. Think back to Julie, the precocious reader we met earlier. She read fluently at age 4. How do we intuitively predict her college GPA? System 1 is quick to construct a narrative. Early reading suggests academic talent, and this talent is linked, however indirectly, to a strong GPA. Your mind quickly accesses a norm for precocious children and maps it onto the scale of college performance. The result? A prediction that's likely extreme, perhaps a 3.7 or 3.8, delivered with confidence, but largely non-regressive. Your prediction matches the perceived quality of the evidence, even if that evidence is flimsy. This leads to the illusion of validity. Our subjective confidence in our judgments is determined by the coherence of the story we've constructed, not by the actual predictive quality of the evidence. We feel confident because the story is compelling, and System 1 is designed to create compelling stories even when information is scarce. This is the essence of WYSIT. What you see is all there is. We operate with the information immediately available, oblivious to what might be missing. This tendency toward non-regressive intuitions is particularly problematic in professions where predictions are crucial, like stock picking. Many believe they possess a special skill, an intuition for identifying winning stocks. Yet research, including the studies by Terence Odine and Brad Barber, shows that individual investors who trade actively and rely on their intuitions often perform worse than those who do nothing. Professional fund managers, despite their expertise, largely fail to consistently outperform the market. Their success year after year is often attributed more to luck than to demonstrable skill. The illusion of stock-picking skill is pervasive, supported by the culture of the financial industry and the powerful WISIT mechanism that fuels overconfidence. This brings us to the illusion of skill itself. We tend to believe we are better than average on most desirable traits. This isn't necessarily conscious arrogance, it's a cognitive bias. When asked if you're a good driver, the answer is immediate. But asked if you're better than average, you must first grapple with what average means. System 1, ever eager to provide a quick answer, often substitutes a simpler question: how good am I? The result is an inflated sense of our own abilities. This overconfidence is amplified when we're experts in a field, as Philip Tetlock's 20-year study on political forecasting revealed.
Experts, especially those in the limelight, were often less accurate than their more humble colleagues, their deep knowledge, ironically, fueling an exaggerated belief in their predictive prowess. So, when can we trust expert intuition? Gary Klein, a researcher specializing in naturalistic decision-making, and I embarked on an adversarial collaboration to answer this very question. We concluded that true expertise, and thus reliable intuition, emerges under specific conditions. First, the environment must be sufficiently regular and predictable. This means there are discernible patterns that can be learned. Chess, bridge, and firefighting are good examples. Conversely, predicting long-term political events or the stock market operates in a zero-validity environment, where even the most knowledgeable individuals struggle to make accurate predictions. Second, there must be ample opportunity to learn these regularities through prolonged practice, coupled with quick and unambiguous feedback on the correctness of one's actions. Think of a skilled pianist mastering a piece, or a firefighter intuitively sensing danger. They've had countless hours of practice and immediate feedback. Contrast this with a physician diagnosing a rare disease, where feedback is often delayed, ambiguous, or absent, making it difficult to develop reliable intuition. When these conditions are met, intuition, essentially recognition of familiar patterns, can be remarkably accurate. But when the environment is irregular or the opportunity for learning is limited, intuition can be misleading, often substituting a plausible but incorrect answer derived from heuristics. Crucially, subjective confidence is not a reliable indicator of accuracy. The fact that an intuition feels right or that a story is coherent does not mean it is true. This brings us to the illusion of validity, where we are confident in our judgments even when they are demonstrably flawed, as my own experience with evaluating Army cadets sadly illustrated. This is where the outside view becomes indispensable. While our intuitive system 1 is drawn to the specific details of a case, the inside view, it often fails to consider the statistical base rates of similar situations. My own experience with the curriculum development team, where our overly optimistic 2-year timeline drastically ignored the historical data of similar failed or protracted projects, served as a stark lesson. Seymour Fox, our curriculum expert, could recall the base rates, a 40% failure rate and a 7 to 10-year completion time for similar projects, but these facts remained disconnected from our optimistic inside view. This planning fallacy, the tendency to make overly optimistic forecasts, is fueled by our preference for the inside view and our neglect of base rates. When we focus on what we know, on our own plans and skills, WISIT, and overlook the vast majority of ways things can go wrong, or the success rates of others in similar endeavors, we fall prey to this fallacy. The outside view, by focusing on statistical regularities in an appropriate reference class, offers a powerful corrective. It reminds us that our specific case is not unique, and that the base rates for similar projects or outcomes are a crucial anchor for our predictions. It's a difficult but essential habit to cultivate, to step back from the specifics of a problem and consider the broader statistical context. This is where we can begin to tame our intuitive predictions, grounding them in a more realistic assessment of uncertainty. This is where we begin to understand that the world is often less predictable than we believe, and that our confidence in our predictions is rarely warranted. As we move forward, remember that while intuition can be a powerful tool, it requires the diligent oversight of System 2 and a conscious effort to seek the outside view, especially when the stakes are high. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate appeal of our intuitive responses with the more measured, statistically informed perspective that can lead to more accurate and robust judgments about the future.
the subtle and powerful distortion that shapes how we learn from experience, how we evaluate decisions, and ultimately, how we perceive ourselves and others. At the heart of this illusion is what's often called the narrative fallacy. Our minds have a remarkable, almost compulsive need to create simple, coherent stories from the often chaotic and complex events of the past. We do this to make sense of the world, to impose order on what seems like randomness. But in doing so, we tend to oversimplify, creating narratives that are often too good to be true, too neat, and far too predictable. As Nassim Taleb eloquently put it, we humans constantly fool ourselves by constructing flimsy accounts of the past and believing they are true. This drive to create a coherent story leads directly to what we might call the illusion of inevitability. When we look back at a successful outcome, like the rise of Google, we construct a narrative that makes that success seem like a foregone conclusion. We focus on the series of wise decisions made by the founders, the brilliant strategies employed, and perhaps a single, dramatic moment of luck that amplified their success. We often downplay or ignore the countless other paths the company could have taken, the near misses, and the vast role that pure chance played. The story becomes one of inevitable triumph, masking the true role of luck and the inherent unpredictability of such complex ventures. As I mentioned earlier, fleshed out in more detail, the story could give you the sense that you understand what made Google succeed. It would also make you feel that you have learned a valuable general lesson about what makes businesses succeed. Unfortunately, there is good reason to believe that your sense of understanding and learning from the Google story is largely illusory. This illusion is amplified by a fundamental operating principle of our System 1, often summarized by the acronym WYSIAT. What you see is all there is. Our intuitive system is remarkably adept at constructing a coherent narrative from the information it has readily available, but it is blind to what it does not have. The amount and quality of the evidence are largely irrelevant to the quality of the story that System 1 weaves. When information is scarce, we don't feel uncertainty. Instead, System 1 jumps to conclusions, filling in the gaps to create a complete and satisfying account. We cannot help but deal with the limited information we have as if it were all there is to know. This WYSIAT principle is a powerful contributor to the illusion of validity. Our confidence in a judgment is primarily driven by the coherence of the story our mind has constructed, not by the actual quality or quantity of the evidence supporting it. This leads to overconfidence, especially when we are presented with vivid, consistent information, even if that information is limited or unreliable. Think back to our experience evaluating soldiers on the obstacle course. Our impressions were compelling, forming coherent narratives about their leadership potential. Yet the objective outcome, their actual performance in training, was notoriously difficult to predict. Despite knowing our forecasts were largely useless, the feeling of understanding, of seeing clearly, persisted. Our expectations for the soldier's future performance were a clear instance of substitution, and of the representativeness heuristic in particular. Having observed 1 hour of a soldier's behavior in an artificial situation, we felt we knew how well he would face the challenges of officer training and of leadership in combat. Crucially, this illusion of understanding fosters a bias we call hindsight bias, or the "I knew it all along" effect. Once an event has occurred, it becomes almost impossible to reconstruct our past beliefs accurately. We rewrite our own history, distorting our past beliefs to align with the present reality. This makes us underestimate how surprising past events actually were. Baruch Fischoff's early research demonstrated this powerfully. After Nixon's visit to China, people exaggerated the probability they had originally assigned to that event happening, while downplaying the probability they had assigned to outcomes that did not occur. This bias has significant social costs. It leads to outcome bias, where we evaluate decisions not by the quality of the process at the time they were made, but by the results they produced. A decision that seemed prudent in foresight can appear irresponsible in hindsight, especially if the outcome was negative. The worse the consequence, the greater the hindsight bias. This pressure to appear to have known it all along can discourage necessary risk-taking and lead to overly cautious, bureaucratic decisions. When we learn from the past, we tend to focus on the dramatic, the unexpected, and the causal, rather than the mundane or the probabilistic. We learn lessons from the rare events that stand out in our memory, and we neglect the countless times when nothing out of the ordinary happened. This selective attention, driven by the availability heuristic, further fuels our illusion of understanding. We learn from the dramatic plane crash more than from the millions of safe flights, creating a distorted view of risk. We focus on the single, poignant story of Jen's life, neglecting the duration and the day-to-day experiences that shaped her overall well-being. Ultimately, the illusion of understanding and the grip of hindsight bias are powerful forces. They are comforting in a way, as they impose order on a world that is often random and unpredictable. But this comfort comes at a cost. It can lead to overconfidence, poor judgment, and a distorted view of the past that can ill-prepare us for the future. Recognizing these illusions is the first step towards more accurate understanding and more effective decision-making, both for ourselves and for the organizations we are part of. It requires actively seeking the outside view, questioning our initial intuitions, and reminding ourselves of the vastness of what we do not know. As we move forward, we will explore how these biases, so deeply ingrained in our thinking, influence our choices about risks, our investments, and even our most personal decisions.
Having explored the illusions of understanding in hindsight, we now turn to a critical comparison that sits at the heart of how we make judgments: the often contentious interplay between our own intuitive hunches and the cold, hard logic of formulas. We'll delve into why, in so many situations, a simple algorithm can outperform the nuanced judgment of a seasoned expert, and crucially, when we can indeed trust that expert intuition. Let's start with a seminal finding that has reverberated through fields from psychology to medicine: clinical versus statistical prediction. In the mid-20th century, psychologist Paul Meehl embarked on a project that would eventually lead to a series of studies, famously reviewed in his disturbing little book. Meehl meticulously examined dozens of research papers comparing predictions made by trained human professionals, clinicians, judges, diagnosticians, against predictions generated by simple statistical formulas. The results, gathered across various domains like predicting student success, recidivism rates, and even medical diagnoses, were remarkably consistent. In roughly 60% of these studies, the statistical formulas proved to be more accurate than the human experts. Even when the formulas didn't outright win, they often tied in accuracy. And importantly, these formulas were typically far less costly and time-consuming to implement. Meehl's findings, published in 1954, were met with considerable shock and disbelief within the clinical psychology community. How could a mechanical rule outperform years of training and nuanced human judgment? The clinicians, understandably, felt their expertise was being devalued. They described statistical methods as mechanical, atomic, additive, cut and dried, artificial, unreal, arbitrary, incomplete, dead, pedantic. In contrast, they lauded their own methods as dynamic, global, meaningful, holistic, subtle, sympathetic, configural, patterned, organized, rich, deep, genuine, sensitive, sophisticated, real, living, concrete, natural, true to life, and understanding. This is a powerful testament to the hostility to algorithms that can arise when our deeply ingrained sense of human judgment is challenged. What explains this persistent inconsistency of human judgment? One key factor is the inherent variability in human ratings. Unlike a formula that applies the same rule every time, human judgment is susceptible to countless subtle influences. Think about radiologists evaluating X-rays. Studies show that even experienced professionals will contradict their own earlier ratings 20% of the time when reviewing the same X-ray later. This unreliability, however unintended, is destructive to predictive validity. Furthermore, human judgment is notoriously susceptible to context. A simple reminder of a pleasant experience can make us more optimistic about a current evaluation, while a minor inconvenience can color our entire assessment. This variability and context dependence are precisely what formulas are designed to overcome by offering consistent, reliable outputs. However, it's not always a simple case of formulas being superior. There's a crucial caveat to Meal's findings, often referred to as the broken leg rule. Formulas work best in what we call a regular environment, where the relationship between predictors and outcomes is stable and predictable. If a specific, highly unusual event occurs, a broken leg, metaphorically speaking, that fundamentally changes the situation, then human judgment, particularly when it can recognize and adapt to such novel circumstances, might be warranted. For example, if a statistical formula predicts a successful outcome for a particular student based on their past performance, but you learn that they've recently suffered a significant personal setback, like a serious illness or a family tragedy, that knowledge might justifiably alter your prediction. The formula, by its nature, cannot account for such specific anomalous events. So, when can we trust expert intuition? Gary Klein, a leading researcher in what is known as naturalistic decision-making, emphasizes two critical conditions: a regular environment and sufficient practice with feedback. Think of chess masters. Their ability to perceive complex board positions and instantly recognize winning moves isn't magic. It's the result of tens of thousands of hours of practice in a highly regular environment. They've learned to recognize patterns, and their intuition is essentially rapid pattern recognition. Similarly, firefighters develop an intuition for danger after years of experience. They might not be able to articulate precisely why they feel uneasy about a particular fire, but their System 1 has learned to pick up on subtle cues. Perhaps the fire is too quiet, or the heat feels unusual, that signal danger. This expertise is built on a consistent environment and rapid, clear feedback, allowing their intuitive System 1 to develop accurate predictive models. In contrast, other environments are less regular or even wicked, as Robin Hogarth described them. In these environments, practice can actually lead to learning the wrong lessons. Imagine a doctor who believes a particular treatment is effective because patients who receive it tend to improve. But if the doctor fails to wash his hands between patients, and the patients are also getting sick from poor hygiene, the doctor might mistakenly attribute the improvements to the treatment rather than the lack of infection. In such wicked environments, intuition can become dangerously misleading, reinforcing false beliefs rather than valid insights. Therefore, while formulas often outperform intuition, particularly in low-validity environments where patterns are weak or absent, expert intuition is invaluable when it's built on genuine expertise honed in a regular environment with ample feedback. The challenge, both for individuals and organizations, is to discern when intuition is truly skilled and when it's merely a convincing System 1 heuristic, jumping to a conclusion based on a compelling but ultimately misleading story. This distinction is crucial as we navigate the complexities of our decisions, and, as we'll see, it has profound implications for how we structure our world, from our personal finances to the policies of nations. As we move forward, we'll explore how these principles of intuition versus formulas and the conditions for expert intuition shape our understanding of risk, our choices in the face of uncertainty, and even our perception of reality itself.
We now turn to a particularly pervasive problem, our tendency to be overly optimistic about the future, a phenomenon that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky identified as the planning fallacy. This fallacy stems from what they termed the inside view versus the outside view.
When we adopt the inside view, we focus on the specific circumstances of our own situation, our unique plan, and the reasons why we believe it will succeed. We tend to be optimistic about our own abilities and the attainability of our goals. This is our System 1, in its role as a storyteller, weaving a coherent narrative that often overlooks critical but less accessible information. As Kahneman puts it, our comforting conviction that the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. In contrast, the outside view involves stepping back and considering the statistical base rates of similar cases. It's about recognizing that our specific situation is not entirely unique and that there are predictable patterns in the outcomes of similar endeavors. This is where reference class forecasting comes in. By identifying a relevant reference class, say similar curriculum development projects, kitchen renovations, or even personal projects involving the creation of a textbook, we can access statistical data on how long they typically take, how much they tend to cost, and what proportion of them fail. Kahneman recounts a personal experience that vividly illustrates this disconnect. When his team was developing a high school curriculum, they, with their inside view, estimated a completion time of around 2 years. They were confident, focusing on their plan, their expertise, and the progress they felt they were making. However, when Seymour Fox, the Dean of Education, was asked to consider similar curriculum development projects from an outside view, the picture changed dramatically. He revealed that about 40% of such projects failed, and those that succeeded took between 7 and 10 years to complete. This stark statistical reality, the base rate, was so incompatible with the team's optimistic inside view that they, including Kahneman himself, largely ignored it. They continued their project, which eventually took 8 years and was never used. This illustrates a critical failure, a planning fallacy where we underestimate costs and timelines, and a profound optimistic bias. This bias is pervasive. We tend to believe our own attributes are more favorable than they are, and our goals more achievable than they are likely to be. We overestimate our ability to forecast the future, which fuels an overconfidence that can have significant consequences. Kahneman highlights the entrepreneurial delusions that often accompany this optimism. The statistics for small business survival are sobering, yet entrepreneurs consistently overestimate their own chances of success. They focus on their unique vision, their drive, and their perceived advantages, often neglecting the statistical base rates of failure in their industry. This optimism, while sometimes motivating, can also be costly, leading to wasted resources and dashed hopes when the outside view is ignored. The key takeaway here is that while our intuitive System 1 is adept at creating coherent, optimistic narratives, it often neglects the statistical regularities that an outside view can reveal. To mitigate the planning fallacy and the pervasive optimistic bias, we must actively cultivate the habit of adopting the outside view, consulting reference class forecasts, and honestly confronting the statistical base rates of success and failure. It's a challenging but essential step toward more realistic planning and decision-making. This focus on how we frame our thinking and the biases that arise from our intuitive assessments naturally leads us to consider how we evaluate various outcomes, particularly when those outcomes involve probabilities and potential gains or losses. This brings us to the fascinating realm of prospect theory, which we will next explore.
Having explored the crucial role of the outside view and the often underestimated impact of the planning fallacy, we now turn our attention to a different, yet equally pervasive source of flawed judgment: overconfidence. Kahneman reveals that our excessive confidence in our own knowledge and our forecasts is often fueled by a powerful illusion, making us believe we understand more than we actually do. This illusion of understanding, as we'll see, is intricately linked to our tendency to neglect competition. One of the key concepts here is the illusion of validity. This is the strong, subjective sense of confidence we experience in our judgments, even when the evidence supporting them is flimsy. Our System 1, the fast and intuitive part of our mind, excels at constructing coherent stories from limited information. When these stories feel smooth and complete, even if they're built on shaky foundations, System 2 readily accepts them, inflating our confidence. Kahneman illustrates this with his experiences in the Israeli army. While observing soldiers on an obstacle course, he and his colleagues felt utterly confident in their assessments of leadership potential. Yet when they received feedback weeks later, their predictions of success in officer training proved to be almost entirely useless. Despite knowing the general inaccuracy of their assessments, their confidence in individual judgments remained unshaken. This is the illusion of validity in action. The feeling of confidence is driven by the coherence of the story, not by the actual predictive accuracy of the evidence. This illusion is particularly potent in fields where intuition is highly valued, leading to the illusion of skill. Kahneman discusses the financial markets, where billions of dollars are traded daily based on what many believe to be expert knowledge. However, research like that conducted by Terry Oden on individual investors shows a stark reality. Most individual traders perform worse than a simple do-nothing strategy, and even professional fund managers, despite their experience and hard work, rarely outperform the market consistently. The year-to-year correlation of their success is negligible, suggesting that luck, not skill, is often the primary driver. The illusion of skill persists because the professionals feel they are making sensible, educated guesses, and their subjective confidence, a product of System 1, overrides the objective evidence of their actual performance. Kahneman notes that even financial executives, when presented with data showing the randomness of their success, often dismiss it, clinging to their belief in their own expertise. To understand this further, Kahneman introduces the distinction between hedgehogs and foxes, drawing from Isaiah Berlin's essay. Hedgehogs, in Tetlock's research on political forecasting, know one big thing. They have a grand theory of the world, are opinionated, and remain confident in their predictions, often resisting admitting error. They're the pundits you see on television, delivering clear, decisive pronouncements. Foxes, on the other hand, are complex thinkers. They acknowledge that reality is shaped by many interacting forces, including blind luck, and they are less likely to offer grand theories. Tetlock's 20-year study of political experts revealed that hedgehogs, despite their confidence and visibility, performed worse than dart-throwing monkeys, who would have simply assigned equal probabilities to all outcomes. Foxes, while still performing poorly, were slightly better, but were less likely to be invited onto television shows because their nuanced views are harder to convey. The expert's problem, Tetlock suggests, is not necessarily what they believe, but how they think. They become overconfident because their growing knowledge leads to an enhanced illusion of skill. The prevalence of these illusions among experts, whether in finance, politics, or other fields, is often amplified by competition neglect. Kahneman explains that when individuals or organizations make plans, they tend to focus intensely on their own goals and capabilities, effectively ignoring the actions and intentions of their competitors. This is vividly illustrated by the movie industry's tendency to release major films on the same days, a phenomenon explained by a Disney executive as hubris, the failure to consider that everyone else is thinking the same thing. When planning, we focus on what we know and can do, WYASATI, but we neglect the crucial information about what others are doing. This leads to excess entry into markets, an overestimation of success as more competitors enter than the market can profitably sustain. This brings us to the above-average effect, the pervasive belief that we are better than average on desirable traits.
While it might seem like simple self-aggrandizement, Kahneman suggests it's more of a cognitive bias. When asked if you're a good driver, the answer is usually an easy yes. But when asked if you're better than average, the task becomes more complex, requiring an assessment of the average. System 1, in its characteristic way, substitutes an easier question for a harder one. If you're asked about a skill you find difficult, like striking up conversations with strangers, and the answer isn't immediately obvious, you might even rate yourself as below average. This shows how our intuitive judgments are often shaped by the ease with which an answer comes to mind, leading to an overestimation of our relative standing, especially in activities where we perform moderately well. To combat these pervasive biases, Kahneman emphasizes the need for discipline and the conscious engagement of System 2. He suggests that when we recognize situations that are prone to error, like those involving anchoring, WYASATI, or narrow framing, we should deliberately slow down and engage our more analytical System 2. This is easier said than done, as System 1's intuitions are often compelling and delivered with high confidence. The key takeaway is that subjective confidence is a feeling, not a reliable indicator of accuracy. We must learn to question our intuitions, especially when they come too easily or too confidently, and be wary of the stories our System 1 readily constructs. The recognition of these biases is the first step toward more reasoned judgments, allowing us to temper our overconfidence and acknowledge the limits of our understanding, especially in the face of competition and the inherent unpredictability of the world.
Having explored the power of System 1's associative machine and the sometimes unfortunate consequences of its shortcuts, we now turn to how we make choices, particularly when faced with uncertainty. Here, we'll delve into a crucial departure from purely rational economic models, a departure that reveals a great deal about our intuitive, often illogical decision-making processes. We begin by examining what happened when Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky looked closely at the work of Daniel Bernoulli, a brilliant mathematician from the 18th century. Bernoulli, in his seminal 1738 essay, was wrestling with a question that still resonates today. Why do people prefer a sure thing, even when a gamble offers a higher expected monetary value? He observed that most people dislike risk. If offered a gamble with an 80% chance of winning $100 and a 20% chance of winning nothing, most would choose a sure $80, even though the gamble's expected value is $82. Bernoulli's ingenious solution was to propose that people don't evaluate outcomes by their dollar amounts, but by their psychological value, which he called utility. He hypothesized that utility increases with wealth, but at a diminishing rate. This idea that the psychological impact of wealth is logarithmic is what explains risk aversion. For Bernoulli, the utility gained from going from $100,000 to $1 million was comparable to the utility gained from going from $10 million to $100 million. For nearly 2 centuries, Bernoulli's theory of expected utility held sway. It provided a powerful framework for understanding rational choice and became a cornerstone of economic theory. However, as Kahneman and Tversky began their own investigations, they discovered that Bernoulli's elegant model, while influential, was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Their initial explorations focused on simple gambles, and they noticed a peculiar pattern in their own choices and those of their colleagues. Take, for instance, the choice between A, a sure gain of $100, and B, a 50% chance to win $200 and a 50% chance to win nothing. Most people, including Kahneman and Tversky themselves, naturally preferred the sure gain of $100. This aligns perfectly with Bernoulli's idea of diminishing marginal utility. The certainty of a gain feels more valuable than a gamble with the same expected value. But then came the critical twist.
they started exploring what happens when all the outcomes are losses. Consider this choice. C, a sure loss of $100, D, a 50% chance to lose $200, and a 50% chance to lose nothing. Here, most people, including Kahneman and Tversky, preferred the gamble. The certainty of a loss felt much more aversive than facing the possibility of a larger loss with a chance of escaping unscathed. This mirrored Bernoulli's risk aversion for gains, but in reverse. When faced with only bad options, people became risk-seeking. This observation of contrasting attitudes towards gains and losses was important, but it was a subsequent set of problems that revealed the fundamental flaw in Bernoulli's theory. Kahneman and Tversky presented their participants with these two scenarios. Problem 3. In addition to whatever you own, you have been given $1,000. You are now asked to choose between A, a 50% chance to win $1,000, B, a sure win of $500. Problem 4. In addition to whatever you own, you have been given $2,000. You are now asked to choose between C, a 50% chance to lose $1,000, or D, a sure loss of $500. From a purely economic standpoint, based on Bernoulli's theory of utility of wealth, these two problems are identical. In Problem 3, the possible final states of wealth are either $2,000 or $1,000 with equal probability, or a sure $1,500. In Problem 4, the possible final states of wealth are $1,000 or $3,000 with equal probability, or a sure $1,500. The outcomes, relative to what you own at the start of each problem, are exactly the same. However, when people were presented with these choices, they responded very differently. In Problem 3, dealing with gains, most people preferred the sure win of $500. This is risk aversion, as expected. But then, in Problem 4, dealing with losses, a large majority preferred the gamble, despite the potential for a much larger loss. This is risk-seeking, also as expected. The crucial point here is that the objective outcomes were the same, but the choices were different. Bernoulli's theory, which focuses on final states of wealth, couldn't explain this. The reason for the discrepancy, Kahneman and Tversky realized, lay in something Bernoulli had overlooked: the reference point.
Anthony, with his starting wealth of $1,000, saw the options as a chance to double his money or gain a sure $500. These were clear gains. Betty, with her starting wealth of $4,000, saw the options as a chance to lose a quarter of her wealth or suffer a sure loss of half of it. For Betty, the sure option represented a significant loss, making the gamble, despite its potential for a larger loss, seem relatively attractive. In essence, Anthony was focused on gains, while Betty was focused on losses. Their reference points, the starting wealth in each scenario, changed how they perceived the outcomes, even though the ultimate amounts of money involved were the same. This observation revealed a fundamental flaw in expected utility theory. It failed to account for how the framing of an outcome relative to a reference point shapes our preferences. This led Kahneman and Tversky to develop prospect theory, which posits that people evaluate outcomes not as states of wealth, but as gains and losses relative to a reference point. Prospect theory identified three key features that govern our choices under risk. First, evaluation is relative to a neutral reference point. This reference point is often the status quo, but it can also be an expectation or an entitlement. Second, there is diminishing sensitivity to both gains and losses. The psychological impact of a gain of $100 is much larger than the impact of a gain of $100 when you already possess $1,000.
Similarly, the pain of losing $100 is much greater than the pleasure of gaining $100 when you start with $1,000. This is captured by the S-shaped curve in their value function. And third, and perhaps most importantly, losses loom larger than gains. The pain of losing $100 is greater than the pleasure of gaining $100. This is what we call loss aversion. Bernoulli's error and the subsequent success of prospect theory highlighted a profound truth about human decision-making. We are not the perfectly rational econs of economic theory. We are humans, swayed by emotions, context, and the way information is presented. Our choices are not always guided by objective reality, but by the subjective reality constructed by our System 1, a reality deeply influenced by reference points and a powerful aversion to losses. This insight would become the foundation for much of their subsequent work. As we move forward, we'll see how these principles of reference dependence and loss aversion manifest in other predictable ways, shaping our decisions about everything from investments to everyday purchases. We'll also explore how, by understanding these biases, we can begin to counteract their influence.
Having explored Bernoulli's errors and the reference point, we now turn our attention to loss aversion and the fourfold pattern. This is where we delve into how our preferences are shaped not just by what we stand to gain, but also, and perhaps more powerfully, by what we stand to lose. Kahneman and Tversky discovered that losses, for most people, loom larger than equivalent gains. This fundamental asymmetry, which they termed loss aversion, is a cornerstone of prospect theory. Think about a simple coin toss. If you were offered a gamble, a 50% chance to win $150, or a sure thing of $100, most people would lean towards the sure thing. The potential $150 is attractive, but the fear of getting nothing, of that 50% chance of walking away empty-handed, is often more potent. The thrill of the potential gain doesn't quite outweigh the pain of the possible loss. This is the essence of risk aversion when it comes to gains. But flip the coin, so to speak, and consider losses. If you were faced with losing $900 for sure, or a 50% chance of losing $1,000 and a 50% chance of losing nothing, what would you choose? Many of us, when presented with only negative outcomes, become risk-seeking. The sure loss of $900 is deeply unpleasant, so the prospect of avoiding that loss altogether, even at the risk of a larger loss, becomes appealing. This is the flip side of loss aversion, the tendency towards risk-seeking when all options are negative. These contrasting attitudes, risk aversion for gains and risk-seeking for losses, are not just psychological curiosities. They have profound implications for how we make decisions, particularly when dealing with uncertainty. And this is where prospect theory introduces a powerful framework, explaining these seemingly contradictory behaviors. Kahneman and Tversky observed that our decision weights, the subjective importance we assign to probabilities, are not linear. This means we don't treat a 10% chance the same way we treat a 20% chance, or a 90% chance the same way we treat a 100% chance. This leads to two crucial effects. Firstly, there's the possibility effect. We tend to overweight very low probabilities. Think about buying a lottery ticket. The chance of winning the jackpot is astronomically small, yet millions of people buy tickets. Why? Because that tiny sliver of a chance, the mere possibility of immense wealth, is incredibly appealing. Our decision weights for these unlikely events are disproportionately high, far exceeding their actual statistical probability. This is why lotteries are so popular.
the small chance to win big is given significant weight, often eclipsing a rational calculation of expected value. Secondly, there's the certainty effect. We tend to underweight probabilities that are close to certainty. Imagine you have a 95% chance of winning a substantial amount of money, but a 5% chance of winning nothing. Now, consider a scenario where you have a 100% chance of winning a slightly smaller amount. Most people will gravitate towards the sure thing, even though the gamble's expected value is higher. That 5% chance of ending up with nothing feels much more significant than it logically should, and we are willing to pay a premium to eliminate that sliver of uncertainty. This is the certainty effect at play, and it explains our strong preference for sure things over gambles with high but not absolute probabilities. These two effects, combined with loss aversion, create what Kahneman and Tversky termed the fourfold pattern. This pattern describes how our risk preferences vary depending on the valence of the outcomes, gains versus losses, and the probabilities of those outcomes, rare versus likely. For gains, when facing potential gains, we tend to be risk-averse for high probabilities, preferring a sure gain over a gamble with a high chance of winning, or risk-seeking for low probabilities, preferring a gamble with a small chance of a large gain over a sure smaller gain. This is why insurance for rare but severe losses are attractive, because we tend to overweight those small probabilities. We're willing to pay more than the expected value to avoid the potential disaster. Lotteries, on the other hand, thrive on the possibility effect, where the small chance of an enormous prize is overweighted, making those tickets compelling purchases. These predictable patterns in our choices are crucial. They highlight how our decisions are not always guided by purely rational calculations of expected value, but are deeply influenced by our emotions and the way information is framed. It leads us to decisions that, while sometimes understandable from a psychological perspective, can be costly when viewed through a purely economic or statistical lens. It's a powerful reminder that our intuitions, while often useful, can also lead us astray, particularly when assessing rare events and navigating complex risks. As we move forward, we'll see how these core principles of prospect theory, reference dependence, diminishing sensitivity, and loss aversion shape our decisions in a myriad of ways, often without our conscious awareness.
Having explored the powerful forces of loss aversion and the intriguing patterns of our judgments, we now delve into how the very way information is presented, the frame, can subtly yet powerfully alter our preferences and how we organize our financial lives into separate mental accounts. These concepts, framing effects and mental accounting, reveal another layer of how our two systems interact, often with surprising consequences. Let's begin with framing effects. Imagine you're presented with a choice about saving lives. One option might be, Program A will save 200 people. The alternative, Program B, offers a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. Most people, when faced with this scenario, will choose Program A, the sure thing. They're risk-averse when it comes to gains. Now, consider a slightly different presentation of the exact same situation. This time, it's framed in terms of lives lost. Program C will result in 400 people dying. The alternative, Program D, offers a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Faced with this framing, a stark majority will choose Program D, the gamble. Suddenly, people become risk-seeking. As Kahneman and Tversky observed, the framing of decisions and the psychology of choice can lead to these dramatic shifts in preference, even though the objective outcomes are identical.
This phenomenon, where the presentation of information alters our choices, is known as framing effects. It's a testament to how deeply our System 1, the intuitive, fast-thinking system, is influenced by emotional and associative considerations, rather than purely logical analysis. The words saved or died evoke entirely different emotional responses, shifting us from a mindset of seeking gains to one of avoiding losses. This emotional framing is a powerful tool, and it's not just confined to life or death scenarios. Think about food labeling. A product described as 90% fat-free is far more appealing than the same product described as 10% fat, even though they convey the same nutritional reality. Our System 1 latches on to the positive framing of fat-free, conveniently downplaying the less appealing information. This tendency to frame things emotionally, what Kahneman calls emotional framing, can be exploited. Advertisers and politicians often use this to their advantage, presenting choices in the most favorable light possible. Understanding this allows us to be more critical consumers of information, questioning not just what is being presented, but how it's being presented. Beyond how information is framed, we also organize our financial lives, and indeed many aspects of our lives, into separate mental accounts. This is where Richard Thaler's groundbreaking work comes into play. We don't treat all our money as a single, fungible resource. Instead, we create separate mental accounts for different purposes: spending money, savings, vacation fund, emergency fund. This categorization helps us manage our finances, but it also leads to predictable biases. One of the most striking examples is the disposition effect. Imagine you own two stocks. Stock A, Blueberry Tiles, has appreciated significantly, while stock B, Tiffany Motors, has declined in value. You need to sell one to cover an unexpected expense. Rationally, you should consider which stock is likely to perform better in the future. However, many investors, influenced by their mental accounting, are much more likely to sell the winner, Blueberry Tiles, to book a gain and close that mental account on a positive note. They hold on to the loser, Tiffany Motors, hoping it will recover, thus avoiding the emotional pain of closing that account as a loss. Kahneman highlights this by noting that investors who trade more frequently tend to achieve worse results, as they are constantly acting on these mental accounting biases. This mental accounting also contributes to the sunk cost fallacy. Consider a company that has invested millions in a failing project. As the project continues to underperform, rather than cutting their losses, they often feel compelled to invest even more money. Why? Because abandoning the project would mean acknowledging the initial investment as a complete loss, a painful outcome for their mental accounting. It's the mental equivalent of thinking, we've already put so much into this, we can't stop now, even though the future prospects are bleak. This is particularly true for individuals who own the project, as admitting failure would be personally costly.
Rare events and overweighting. We've explored how framing effects can subtly alter our choices and how we mentally categorize our finances, leading to distinct patterns of spending and saving. Now, we turn to a particularly potent aspect of our intuitive System 1, its reaction to rare events. It's a realm where our emotions often hijack our rational judgment, leading to predictable errors in how we perceive and respond to the world. Consider for a moment the pervasive impact of terrorism. We all experienced it. Perhaps it's a news report, a conversation, or simply a passing thought. The sheer vividness of a terrorist act, the images of destruction, the stories of loss, lodges itself in our minds with remarkable tenacity. This accessibility, this ease with which these events come to mind, is a powerful force. It's what psychologists call the availability heuristic. And when it comes to rare but dramatic events, it can lead to something called an availability cascade. Think about what happens after a major terrorist attack. For a period, the media coverage is intense. Conversations are dominated by the event. Suddenly, the risk of such an occurrence feels much higher, much more immediate than it might be statistically. We become hyper-aware of potential threats, and even benign occurrences, like seeing a bus with tinted windows, can trigger a jolt of anxiety. This amplification, fueled by media attention and our own emotional responses, creates a self-perpetuating cycle. The more we talk about it, the more we hear about it, the more available it becomes in our memory, and the more we overestimate its probability. This leads to a phenomenon known as overweighting of rare events. Our System 1, designed to react to immediate threats and salient information, assigns disproportionate weight to these vivid, memorable occurrences. It's as if the sheer emotional impact of a rare event overshadows its actual statistical rarity. The terror of a bombing, for instance, is a far more potent input to our emotional System 1 than the statistical certainty that you are statistically more likely to be injured in a car accident on your way to the bus stop. This emotional amplification is closely linked to what is termed probability neglect. Our emotional response to a risk is often not proportional to its likelihood. The fear of a plane crash, for example, can be intense, even though statistically flying is incredibly safe. We fixate on the vivid image of the disaster, the catastrophic crash, and neglect the denominator, the sheer vastness of uneventful flights that occur every day. Our System 1 latches on to the dramatic, the emotionally charged, and assigns it a significant weight in our decision-making, regardless of the objective probabilities. The vividness and salience of an event directly influence its decision weight. When we are presented with a rare event, our System 1 doesn't rationally weigh probabilities. Instead, it conjures up images, feelings, and stories. A compelling narrative of a rare event, a terrifying news report, a chilling anecdote, makes that event more accessible, more memorable, and thus more likely to influence our judgments and choices. Furthermore, our minds are prone to denominator neglect. When faced with a risk described as a frequency, like 1 in 1,000 people, we tend to focus on the 1 and neglect the 1,000. This makes a risk seem much larger than it is. Compare that to being told 0.1% of people will experience this. The abstract percentage is far less evocative than the concrete image of 1 person out of 1,000. Our System 1 responds more strongly to the vivid, emotionally charged instance, assigning it a higher decision weight than the raw statistical data would warrant. This is why vivid, emotional appeals can be so effective in shaping public opinion and policy, often leading to an overreaction to rare but dramatic risks. What does this mean for us? It means that our intuitive judgments about risks are often skewed. We are more likely to fear what is easily recalled than what is statistically probable. We tend to overweight the rare, the dramatic, the emotionally charged, and underweight the common, the mundane, and the statistically significant. This understanding offers practical wisdom. When making important decisions, especially those involving risk, it's crucial to engage our System 2. We need to consciously ask ourselves, is this an availability heuristic at play? Am I overweighting a rare event because it's vivid and memorable? Am I neglecting the denominator?
By recognizing these tendencies, we can begin to temper our intuitive responses with a more rational assessment of probabilities and actual risks. We can remind ourselves that what is easily recalled is not necessarily what is most likely. This conscious effort to step back, to analyze, and to seek out objective data, rather than relying solely on immediate impressions, is a critical skill for navigating a world that is often far more predictable than our vivid, emotional System 1 would have us believe. As we move forward, we'll explore how these biases in assessing rare events also influence our understanding of expertise and our reliance on our own intuitive predictions, especially when those predictions are bolstered by a strong sense of confidence.
Having explored the intricacies of rare events and our tendency to overweight them, we now turn to the crucial concepts of risk policies and broad framing. This shift in focus is vital because our decision-making processes are not always consistent. Often, we make choices in isolation without a guiding framework, which can lead to suboptimal outcomes. Today, we'll delve into how adopting a broader perspective and establishing clear risk policies can significantly improve the quality of our judgments. We begin by contrasting two fundamental approaches to decision-making: narrow framing versus broad framing. Narrow framing means we assess decisions independently, one by one as they arise. It's like looking at each gamble in isolation. Broad framing, on the other hand, involves integrating multiple choices into a larger, overarching decision. This integrated approach allows us to see how individual choices fit into a bigger picture, often revealing inconsistencies in our preferences when decisions are made piecemeal. A classic illustration of this is Samuelson's problem, named after the Nobel laureate economist. Samuelson posed a simple gamble to his friend. Would you accept a coin toss where you could lose $100 or win $200? Samuelson's friend, like most people, wisely rejected this single gamble. The risk of losing seemed more salient than the potential gain. However, when Samuelson offered to let his friend play this gamble 100 times, the friend enthusiastically accepted. This is where the brilliance lies. The friend's intuition about the single gamble was consistent with risk aversion, but when the gambles were aggregated, the outcome was dramatically different. Broad framing, in this case, revealed the folly of the narrow approach. The aggregated gamble was so overwhelmingly favorable that even a risk-averse individual would logically embrace it. This aggregation, or broad framing, is how experienced traders and sophisticated investors often manage their portfolios, effectively win a few, lose a few, and averaging out the emotional impact of individual outcomes. This brings us to the concept of risk policies. A risk policy is essentially a broad frame applied consistently to a range of decisions. It's a set of rules that guide our choices, ensuring that we don't fall prey to the emotional sway of individual circumstances. Think about insurance. A risk policy might be to always take the highest possible deductible, or to never buy extended warranties. These policies are designed to manage risk over the long term, rather than reacting emotionally to each specific decision. They act as a buffer against the potent emotional impact of losses, a concept we've explored extensively. By having a predefined policy, we effectively pre-commit to a broad frame, thereby mitigating the influence of narrow framing and its associated biases. Unfortunately, the pervasive tendency to engage in narrow framing is often amplified by loss aversion. Because losses loom larger than gains in our psychological experience,
We are more likely to make decisions in isolation when those decisions involve potential losses. This makes us overly cautious in the face of single, unfavorable gambles, even when aggregating them would reveal a more rational, less risky path. The curse of narrow framing, when combined with loss aversion, is that it leads us to reject favorable aggregated gambles and accept unfavorable ones when viewed in isolation. The antidote to this costly curse lies in adopting a risk policy that embraces broad framing. This means shifting our perspective from individual events to a broader pattern, acknowledging that while we might win a few, lose a few, the overall trend, guided by a well-considered policy, will likely be more favorable. It's about cultivating the mindset of an experienced trader who understands that short-term fluctuations are normal and that a consistent strategy over time is key to long-term success. By consciously adopting broad frames and risk policies, we can move beyond the emotional responses that often hijack our decision-making processes and towards more rational, consistent, and ultimately more beneficial choices. This principle extends beyond financial decisions. It applies to how we evaluate professions, manage our health, and even make choices about our personal lives. By consistently asking ourselves, is this decision framed narrowly or broadly? And by establishing clear, predefined risk policies, we can begin to tame the powerful influence of our intuitive System 1 and allow our more deliberative System 2 to guide us towards better outcomes. This journey into risk policies and broad framing sets the stage for understanding how we can actively shape our decision-making processes for the better. The mantra, "You win a few, you lose a few," encapsulates the essence of this broader perspective, encouraging us to accept the inherent variability in outcomes and to focus on the long-term strategy rather than the emotional impact of isolated events.
Having explored risk policies and broad framing, we now turn to a more intimate aspect of our decision-making landscape: how we keep mental score and the powerful emotions of regret that often accompany our choices. At its core, our tendency to keep score is revealed through mental accounting. We don't treat all our money, all our experiences, or all our potential outcomes as a single, undifferentiated whole. Instead, we organize our lives into separate mental accounts. Think about it. You have your spending money account, your education savings account, and perhaps even a separate account for emergency medical funds. This isn't a rational, unified ledger like an accountant would maintain. Econs, the rational agents of economic theory, have a single, comprehensive view of their wealth. But we, humans, guided by our dual systems, create these distinct mental buckets. This mental accounting serves as a form of self-control, a way to manage our impulses and budget our resources. It's how we might limit our daily espresso intake or commit to more exercise. But this system of keeping score also has a darker side. It's intimately linked to the disposition effect, that well-documented tendency for investors to sell their winning stocks too soon while holding on to their losers. Why? Because closing an account with a gain feels good. It scores a success. Closing an account with a loss, however, is painful. It's like trying to finish every mental account with a positive balance, a desire to avoid the sting of admitting a failure. This brings us directly to the concept of regret, a powerful counterfactual emotion. We're often driven not just by what we want to gain, but by what we want to avoid losing. And when it comes to regret, our minds play tricks on us. We tend to experience more regret for actions that lead to negative outcomes than for the same negative outcomes that happen through inaction. Think about the investor who bought a stock for $100 and it's now worth $50. If they sold it at $50, the feeling of loss is acute. But if they held on to it and its value dropped to $50,
the regret is often less intense. The sting of closing an account with a loss, especially when that loss stems from an action, is far greater than the sting of passively accepting a loss. This is where the distinction between action and omission becomes critical. We tend to blame ourselves more for actions that lead to bad outcomes, even if the outcome would have been the same if we had done nothing. Imagine two scenarios, one where you actively choose to deviate from the default, and another where the default action is taken. If something goes wrong, you'll feel more regret for the action you took, even if the outcome was identical to the default. This is the sunk cost fallacy at play, a powerful bias where we continue investing in a failing project or endeavor simply because we've already invested so much. We don't want to admit that our past investments were a mistake, so we throw good money after bad, driven by the desire to avoid the regret of a sunk cost. This aversion to regret and the preference for the status quo is deeply ingrained in us. It influences everything from our purchasing decisions to our major life choices. Consider the default option. When offered a choice, and one option is presented as the default, the path of least resistance, the action that requires no effort, we are far more likely to stick with it. This is partly due to default options themselves, which can be framed as normal or sensible. But it's also because deviating from a default requires conscious effort. It means actively choosing. And that act of commission, when things go wrong, is far more likely to evoke regret than the inaction of simply going with the default. So how do we navigate this complex interplay of mental accounts, regret, and our deeply ingrained tendencies? The key, as Daniel Kahneman argues, lies in recognizing these biases and making a conscious effort to override them, particularly when the stakes are high. By understanding how our System 1 generates these powerful, often misleading intuitions, we can better equip our System 2 to intervene, to slow down, and to make more rational, less emotionally driven decisions. This leads us to the concept of risk policies. Instead of making individual, narrow-framed decisions each time we face a gamble, we can develop broader, more encompassing risk policies. This is akin to adopting the outside view in planning, where we look at statistics of similar endeavors rather than getting lost in the specifics of our own unique situation. By having a clear risk policy, we can manage our emotional responses to individual losses and gains, recognizing that in the long run, a portfolio of many small bets, where you win some and lose some, is far more sensible than agonizing over each individual outcome. It's about adopting a long-term perspective, a broader frame that acknowledges the inherent unpredictability of life and mitigates the emotional toll of our mental accounting. As we move forward, understanding these biases is not just an academic exercise. It's a vital step towards making better choices and living lives that are not solely dictated by the remembering self's imperfect and often misleading scorekeeping.
Experienced utility versus decision utility. Having explored the fascinating world of mental accounting, the emotions tied to regret, and the intricate ways we keep score in our lives, we now pivot to a crucial distinction that underpins much of our decision-making: the difference between experienced utility and decision utility. This is where we begin to unpack the subtle and often misleading ways our minds evaluate pleasure and pain, shaping the choices we make. At its core, experienced utility is about the quality of a moment, how we actually feel during an experience. It's the raw, subjective experience of pleasure or pain. Think of the sting of a burn, the delight of a beautiful sunset, or the tediousness of a long meeting. These are snapshots of our lived moments, the raw data of our senses and emotions. Decision utility, on the other hand, is about the attractiveness of an option, what we want and what we predict we will feel.
It's the cognitive evaluation that guides our choices, often looking towards the future and forecasting how much pleasure or pain we anticipate from a particular course of action. When we choose an investment, decide on a medical treatment, or select a vacation destination, we are primarily guided by decision utility. The tension between these two arises because our remembering self, the part of us that constructs narratives and makes decisions, is often a poor judge of our experiencing self, the part of us that actually lives the moments. As Daniel Kahneman eloquently puts it, referencing the psychophysical work of Gustav Fechner, our minds are not built to simply add up moments of pleasure or pain. Instead, we often rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, that, while efficient, can lead to systematic errors. One of the key tools to measure momentary experience, though perhaps not yet fully realized in Kahneman's early conceptualizations, is the idea of a hedonometer. Imagine an instrument that could objectively measure the level of pleasure or pain experienced at any given moment. If we could plot this over time, we could then calculate the total experienced utility by measuring the area under the curve. This approach, which echoes the 19th century speculation of Edgeworth, acknowledges the crucial role of time and the progression of feelings. However, the remembering self, the narrator of our lives, doesn't always consult the hedonometer. Instead, it relies on a few pivotal moments, the peak intensity of an experience, whether good or bad, and the way the experience ends. This peak end rule, as demonstrated in the now famous cold hand experiments, means that the duration of an experience often has surprisingly little impact on our memory of it. A painful procedure that ends with a mild discomfort is remembered far more favorably than a shorter, equally painful procedure that ends with a sharp, intense sting. This duration neglect is a powerful demonstration of how our memories, and therefore our decisions about future experiences, can be distorted. This disconnect between what we actually feel and what we remember feeling is a fundamental challenge when trying to understand human well-being. While our experiencing self lives in the present, our remembering self governs our choices, often based on a narrative that emphasizes the memorable moments over the passage of time. This is why, for instance, a vacation that is packed with activities might be remembered fondly, even if the experiencing self found some of those activities tedious. The remembering self focuses on the highlights, the peak moments, and the overall impression, rather than a precise accounting of every hour. Bernoulli's early insights into utility, while groundbreaking, fell into a similar trap by focusing on states of wealth rather than the changes in wealth that people actually experience. Bernoulli's utility function, while capturing diminishing sensitivity to wealth, overlooked the crucial role of a reference point and the asymmetry between gains and losses. Kahneman and Tversky, through their work on prospect theory, brought this crucial distinction to the forefront. They highlighted that our preferences are not fixed, but are powerfully influenced by reference points, and that losses loom larger than gains. This concept of loss aversion explains why we often reject gambles with positive expected values, preferring a sure thing, and why we are more willing to take risks when faced with potential losses. These insights lead us into the core of Kahneman's work and the ideas he developed with Amos Tversky. The predictable way in which our minds deviate from normative rules of rationality, the heuristics we employ, and the biases that arise from them
are not mere quirks. They are fundamental aspects of how our System 1 operates. And understanding these systematic deviations is key to understanding ourselves, our choices, and the world around us. As we move forward, we'll delve deeper into these concepts, exploring how these discrepancies between our experienced and decision-making selves and the often unseen influence of our remembering self shape not just our personal happiness, but also broader societal policies and the very fabric of capitalism itself. We'll see how these psychological insights challenge traditional economic models and offer a more nuanced and often more humbling view of human judgment and choice. Let's pause here to let these ideas settle. The distinction between experienced and decision utility, the power of our remembering self, and the fundamental asymmetry of loss aversion are profound concepts. They lay the groundwork for understanding many of the subsequent phenomena we will explore, from the way we react to rare events to the pervasive optimism that drives so much of human endeavor. We now turn our attention to the fourfold pattern, a framework that elegantly captures how our preferences for gains and losses, coupled with how we weigh probabilities, create distinct patterns of risk-taking. This will lead us directly into understanding how we grapple with rare events and how our emotional responses, rather than pure logic, often dictate our perception of risk. From there, we'll consider the importance of risk policies, established guidelines that can help us navigate these complex judgments, and then move into the concept of keeping score, exploring how our mental accounts and the emotions they evoke can lead us astray. And finally, we'll touch upon the powerful and often problematic influence of reversals in our judgments and the pervasive impact of frames and reality on our decisions, setting the stage for our final exploration of the two selves that reside within us.
We've been exploring the fascinating landscape of how our minds make judgments and decisions, navigating the interplay between our fast-thinking System 1 and our slower, more deliberate System 2. We've seen how System 1 effortlessly conjures impressions and intuitions, often leading us down paths that bypass effortful reasoning, a process that can be both remarkably efficient and prone to systematic errors. Now we turn our attention to a particular set of errors that profoundly shape our memories and our subsequent choices, errors that arise from the way we reconstruct our past experiences. This brings us to the concepts of duration neglect and the peak-end rule. To understand these concepts, let's consider a study involving colonoscopies, a procedure that many find inherently unpleasant. Imagine two patients undergoing this process. Patient A experiences a moderately painful procedure for 8 minutes, with the pain level fluctuating but remaining consistently unpleasant. At the very end, there's a brief spike in pain, rated an 8 out of 10. Patient B, on the other hand, endures the same procedure for a much longer 24 minutes. However, their experience starts with a similar moderate pain level, and importantly, it ends with a much milder level of pain, a 1 out of 10. Now here's where it gets interesting. If you were to ask these patients which procedure was worse, the overwhelming majority would point to patient A. Why? Because their memories of the experience are not a faithful record of every moment. Instead, our memories seem to be governed by two distinct rules, the peak-end rule and duration neglect. The peak-end rule dictates that our overall memory of an episode is disproportionately influenced by two specific points, the most intense moment, the peak, and the feeling at the very end. In the colonoscopy study, patient A's memory was dominated by that final painful spike, while patient B's memory was shaped by the relatively mild pain at the end. Coupled with this is duration neglect.
The actual length of the experience, whether it was 8 minutes or 24, had virtually no impact on how the patients remembered and evaluated their ordeal. This is a profound departure from how we might expect rational beings to assess their experiences. Logically, patient B endured significantly more discomfort, yet their memory of the event was far more favorable. This leads us to a crucial distinction that permeates our lives: the difference between our experiencing self and our remembering self. The experiencing self is the one living through the moment, feeling the pleasure and the pain as it happens. The remembering self, on the other hand, is the storyteller, the one that constructs a narrative of our experiences, keeping those stories for future reference. And as we've just seen, the remembering self often misrepresents the actual experience, heavily influenced by the peak and the end, and largely ignoring the duration. This divergence between the experiencing self and the remembering self has significant implications for how we make decisions. When we choose to repeat an experience, to revisit a vacation spot, or even to undergo a medical procedure again, it's the remembering self that's largely in charge. And because the remembering self prioritizes memorable moments and neglects duration, it can lead us to make choices that are not necessarily in the best interest of our experiencing self. Consider the colonoscopy study again. When participants were asked, which experience would you prefer to repeat, a significant majority chose the longer yet milder ending procedure. They were essentially choosing to endure more actual pain because it would result in a better memory. This highlights how our decisions are often guided not by the overall experience, but by the narrative we construct about it. This leads us to the idea of life as a story. We don't just accumulate moments, we weave them into narratives. The ending of a story, and particularly memorable moments within it, often define its character. This is why we might find ourselves drawn to challenging vacations or intense experiences, not necessarily because we anticipate enjoying every moment, but because we anticipate a good story to tell later. The remembering self craves memorable moments, and this craving can influence our decisions, sometimes even at the expense of the experiencing self's comfort. This also explains a phenomenon known as miswanting. This occurs when we mispredict what will make us happy in the future. Because our predictions are largely based on the remembering self's evaluations, which are biased by the peak-end rule and duration neglect, we often set goals that, when achieved, don't bring the happiness we anticipated. We might choose a career path based on the thrill of a potential high point, neglecting the mundane or unpleasant stretches in between. This brings us to the idea of amnesiac vacations. Imagine you're planning a trip. You want it to be memorable. You want good stories to bring back. But what if all your photos and videos were destroyed after the vacation and you were given a pill to erase all memories of it? How would that change your plans? Many people report that this prospect significantly diminishes the value of a vacation. They might even opt for a less intense but more consistently pleasant experience if they knew they wouldn't have memories of it. This underscores the remembering self's powerful influence on our choices, even when those choices involve sacrificing actual present enjoyment for a potentially flawed memory. So, while our experiencing self is what truly lives our lives, moment by moment, it's the remembering self that often dictates what we choose to do next. And because the remembering self is governed by the peak-end rule and duration neglect, it can lead to decisions that seem, from a purely rational standpoint, rather peculiar. Understanding this distinction is key to understanding not just our personal choices, but also the collective decisions that shape our societies. It helps explain why a brief moment of intense joy or suffering can overshadow years of average experience, and why sometimes less truly can be more when it comes to crafting a lasting memory. As we move forward, we'll see how these principles of duration neglect and the peak-end rule,
along with the powerful influence of our remembering self, shape everything from our financial decisions to our understanding of well-being.
Well-being, experience versus evaluation. We've explored how our memories shape our perceptions of past events, often through the lens of the remembering self, emphasizing peaks and ends while neglecting duration. Now we shift our focus to how we evaluate our overall well-being, our life satisfaction, and how that too is influenced by these same cognitive tendencies, often diverging from the actual quality of our moment-to-moment experiences. Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues embarked on a fascinating journey to understand well-being, realizing that traditional methods of measuring happiness, like global life satisfaction questions, were largely capturing the evaluations of the remembering self, not the lived experience of the experiencing self. Kahneman proposed that a person's well-being could be measured by the quality of their experiences over time, much like a hedinometer measuring pleasure or pain. However, directly measuring these fleeting moments is challenging. This led to the development of experience sampling, a method where individuals report their feelings at random intervals throughout the day, using technology like cell phones. To make this more practical, the Day Reconstruction Method, or DRM, was developed. Participants would recall their previous day, breaking it down into distinct episodes, and then rate their feelings during each episode. This allowed researchers to approximate the hedonic totals, the actual experienced well-being, by calculating the area under the curve of reported feelings over time. However, what they discovered was a significant departure from this objective measure. The remembering self, it turned out, had a different story to tell. Kahneman found that people's retrospective evaluations of their experiences were largely governed by two key principles: duration neglect and the peak-end rule. We've touched on duration neglect before, but here it means that the length of an experience often has little impact on how we remember it. Instead, our memories are disproportionately influenced by the most intense moment, the peak, and how the experience concluded, the end. Consider the cold hand experiment described in the book. Participants held their hand in painfully cold water. One group experienced a shorter, intensely painful episode, while another endured a longer one that ended with slightly less pain. Rationally, the shorter duration should have been preferred by the experiencing self. However, the remembering self, swayed by the peak pain and the slightly less painful end of the longer episode, judged the longer, albeit more painful overall experience as less bad. This leads to a critical insight. When deciding whether to repeat an experience, we often choose based on our memory of it, not the sum total of our actual experience. As Kahneman puts it, what we learn from the past is to maximize the qualities of our future memories, not necessarily of our future experience. This distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self has profound implications. It explains why we might choose to endure a longer, more painful medical procedure if its end is more pleasant, even if the total pain experienced is greater. It also highlights how our retrospective evaluations can be skewed, leading us to believe that certain life events, like a vacation or even an entire life, are better or worse than they actually were in the moment. This leads us to the concept of experienced well-being versus life satisfaction. While life satisfaction, as measured by global happiness questions, reflects the remembering self's evaluation, experienced well-being reflects the actual feelings of the experiencing self. Research using the DRM found that while income significantly impacts life satisfaction, it has little effect on experienced well-being beyond a certain point, around $75,000 in household income in the U.S., beyond which more money doesn't necessarily translate to more happiness in the moment. However, For the remembering self, higher income continues to correlate with greater life satisfaction. This highlights a disconnect. The remembering self, which makes our life choices, is often guided by a different calculus than the experiencing self, which lives our life. Furthermore, the focusing illusion plays a significant role in how we evaluate our lives. This illusion occurs when we give disproportionate weight to a single aspect of life when asked to make a global judgment. For instance, when asked about life satisfaction, people who recently moved to California might focus heavily on the climate, a salient aspect of their new environment, and consequently overstate its impact on their overall happiness, neglecting other important factors. This is summed up by the powerful statement, "Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it." This illusion can lead to poor decisions as we chase aspects of life that we believe will bring happiness, but ultimately have a smaller impact than we anticipate. The research into well-being reveals that our lives are not lived in a single, coherent narrative for our remembering self, nor are they lived solely for the experiencing self. Instead, we're a collection of two selves with potentially conflicting interests, and our decisions are often guided by the self that has the more immediate and accessible voice, the remembering self. This understanding of how we evaluate our lives and how those evaluations can diverge from our actual experiences sets the stage for our next exploration, which delves into the significant role of goals in shaping both our experiences and our evaluations.
Having explored the complexities of our two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, we now turn to a fundamental distinction that underpins much of Daniel Kahneman's work, the difference between econs and humans. For decades, economic theory has been built on the foundation of econs, perfectly rational agents who are entirely self-interested and whose tastes never change. They are logical, consistent, and impervious to framing effects or emotional influences. They are the idealized beings that economists often use to understand markets and predict behavior. But we, as actual people, are not econs. We are humans, and humans, as Kahneman has meticulously demonstrated, are far more complex and, frankly, far less rational. We are driven by two systems, System 1, operating quickly and automatically, and System 2, which is slower, more deliberate, and requires effort. Our experiences are shaped by our econs, but our decisions are often made by our humans, guided by System 1's impressions and intuitions. This is where the concept of rationality as coherence versus reasonableness comes into play. While econs operate with perfect internal coherence, humans often make choices that are perfectly reasonable in the moment, even if they aren't strictly logical or optimal in the long run. This understanding leads us to the concept of libertarian paternalism. Kahneman, along with his colleague Amos Tversky, proposed that instead of trying to force econs into the real world or trying to eliminate the human's less rational tendencies, we can instead accept humans as they are. Libertarian paternalism, as introduced by Thaler and Sunstein, is about nudging without restricting freedom. It's about designing environments, what they call choice architecture, in a way that subtly encourages good choices, but always allows individuals the freedom to opt out. Think about the default option for retirement plans. By automatically enrolling employees with the option to opt out, the system nudges them towards saving more. This leverages the laziness of System 2. It requires more effort to not save than to let the default option take effect. Kahneman illustrates this with the now famous Save More Tomorrow program. This program, developed by Thaler and Shlomo Benartzi, allows employees to commit to increasing their savings rate in the future, specifically when they receive a raise.
The brilliance of this program lies in its psychological insight. It avoids the immediate pain of a pay cut by tying the increased savings to a future positive event, a raise. By framing the increased saving as a foregone gain rather than an immediate loss, it bypasses the strong aversion to losses that characterizes our System 1. The result? Millions of workers have significantly improved their savings habits, demonstrating the power of nudging people towards their own long-term interests without infringing on their autonomy.
Having explored the often surprising ways econs and humans differ and how the principles of libertarian paternalism offer a framework for gentle guidance, we now turn to a crucial, perhaps the most practical aspect of our journey: how to tame the biases that cloud our judgment and lead us astray in our decision-making. Kahneman, in his collaboration with Amos Tversky, laid bare the systematic errors that punctuate our thinking, not as random stumbles, but as predictable patterns arising from the very architecture of our minds. These patterns, these cognitive minefields, are the focus of our attention. Our intuitive System 1, while remarkably efficient for navigating the everyday, can lead us into trouble when faced with complex or statistically nuanced situations. It readily jumps to conclusions, constructs coherent narratives from limited information, and can be swayed by emotional framing and the sheer ease with which an idea comes to mind. System 2, our more deliberate and effortful thinker, is often too lazy or too busy to catch these errors. The goal, then, is not to eliminate System 1, but to understand its strengths and weaknesses, and to know when to slow down and engage System 2 more effectively. To achieve this, we need more than just a general awareness of our cognitive pitfalls. We need a richer language, as Kahneman emphasized in his hopes for informed gossip. Think of how a physician uses a vast vocabulary of medical terms to diagnose and treat illness. Similarly, a deeper understanding of judgment and choice requires specific labels for the systematic errors we make. Kahneman's work provides us with these labels: the halo effect, anchoring, availability, representativeness, prospect theory, the endowment effect, and many more. Each of these concepts acts like a diagnostic tool, making it easier to anticipate, recognize, and ultimately correct the mistakes of others and, crucially, of ourselves. One of the key strategies for navigating these cognitive minefields involves actively counter the tendencies of System 1. For organizations, this involves implementing structured strategies. Kahneman highlights the power of checklists, which ensure that critical steps are not overlooked, much like a pilot's pre-flight routine. He also champions reference class forecasting, a method that anchors our predictions in statistical data from similar past projects rather than relying solely on the inside view of our specific endeavor, a direct antidote to the planning fallacy that leads us to underestimate costs and timelines. And then there's the pre-mortem, a technique where a team imagines a project has failed spectacularly and then works backward to identify the potential causes of that failure. This powerful exercise, as Gary Klein suggests, unleashes imagination in a much-needed direction, helping to uncover unknown unknowns that could derail even the most carefully laid plans. The value of this richer language for criticism cannot be overstated. By having precise labels for biases, we can more effectively learn from others' mistakes. It's far easier to identify the halo effect in a colleague's assessment of a charismatic speaker than to recognize it in our own fleeting first impression. Similarly, understanding the availability heuristic helps us question whether our fear of flying is truly proportional to the risk, or if it's simply fueled by vivid media portrayals of plane crashes. Learning from others' experiences, particularly their documented errors, can be a powerful shortcut, preventing us from making the same mistakes ourselves. Ultimately, the interaction between System 1 and System 2 is a delicate dance. System 1 operates automatically and effortlessly,
generating impressions, intuitions, and feelings that often guide our actions. System 2 allocates attention to effortful mental activities, but it is often lazy, reluctant to engage unless absolutely necessary. Acknowledging their respective strengths and weaknesses is paramount. System 1 provides the speed and fluency that allows us to navigate the world with relative ease, while System 2 offers the capacity for deliberate thought, logical reasoning, and self-control. The challenge lies in knowing when to trust System 1's quick impressions and when to engage System 2's more deliberate and often more accurate analysis.
And so we reach the conclusion of our deep dive into Daniel Kahneman's groundbreaking work, Thinking Fast and Slow. We've journeyed through the intricate landscape of our own minds, exploring the swift, intuitive world of System 1 and the deliberate, effortful realm of System 2. We've uncovered how the associative machine and the subtle power of priming shape our thoughts, how loss aversion and the anchoring effect can steer our decisions, and how our memories, governed by the peak and rule and duration neglect, often paint a picture of our past that differs from the reality of our experiences. We've learned about the distinction between econs and humans, the predictable biases that influence our judgments, and the insightful principles of libertarian paternalism that suggest how we can be nudged towards better choices without sacrificing our freedom. From mental accounting and the sting of regret to the fundamental differences in experienced versus decision utility, Kahneman's insights offer a powerful lens through which to understand ourselves, our strengths, our weaknesses, and the often surprising ways we make sense of the world. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate our intuition, but to understand its patterns and to know when to engage our System 2 for more deliberate reflection. By recognizing these cognitive tendencies, we equip ourselves to make more reasoned and, ultimately, more effective decisions in all aspects of our lives. If you found this exploration of Thinking Fast and Slow valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Nocturnal Knowledge. Your support helps us continue to bring you these illuminating journeys into the world's most influential books. Carry these ideas with you. Observe your own thinking, and perhaps, just perhaps, you'll find yourself navigating the world and your own mind with a little more wisdom. Thank you for joining us.